12 Ivy League interpreters were actively failing to stop a massacre, and Bethany Foster was trapped squarely in the middle of it. Pressing her heavy, trembling frame against a polished marble reception desk, the chubby night cleaner clutched a bottle of bleach like a lifeline. Just feet away, Darcel Simmons, the undisputed king of the East Coast Mafia, checked his custom Patek Philippe watch. He was seconds away from a brutal execution over a mistranslated Russian threat. He desperately needed a miracle to survive. What he received was a terrified, overweight woman in a snug polyester uniform who secretly understood every lethal whisper. Bethany Foster was entirely used to being invisible. At 32, she was a woman whose physical presence took up space, yet she was rarely ever seen. She was undeniably fat, a fact she had long ago accepted with a mixture of resignation and quiet dignity. Her blue polyester cleaning uniform was always a size too snug across her broad hips and thick waist, the fabric chafing as she pushed her heavy yellow cart down the endless, gleaming corridors of the Callaway building. Her knees constantly ached from the sheer weight she carried during her 10-hour night shifts, and her round, flushed face was perpetually slick with a thin sheen of sweat. To the high-powered executives, the ruthless corporate lawyers, and the shadowy figures who occupied the penthouse levels of the city's financial district, Bethany was part of the furniture. She was the entity that emptied the trash, polished the mahogany conference tables, and scrubbed the marble floors while the city slept. They looked through her, past her, and sometimes even stepped over her wet floor signs without a downward glance. But Bethany possessed a secret that none of the men in $1,000 suits could possibly fathom. Her mind was a steel trap, an intricate web of syntax, grammar, and phonetics. Raised in a crumbling foster home system that housed immigrants from every corner of the globe, and later working the night shift at a 24-hour international call center before it went bankrupt, Bethany had developed an astonishing, almost savant-like ear for languages. While she scrubbed toilets, her cheap earbuds were always firmly in place, pumping Mandarin, Russian, Arabic, and Sicilian dialects into her brain. She absorbed languages like a sponge, understanding the subtle inflections, the regional slang, and the cultural idioms that textbook learners completely miss. Tonight was supposed to be a standard Tuesday. Bethany was scheduled to deep clean the 42nd floor, a restricted level leased under the ambiguous name of Simmons Enterprises. She knew, as did anyone with half a brain in the city, that Darcel Simmons did not trade in standard corporate stocks. Darcel was the young, ruthless heir to the Simmons crime family. He had taken over the syndicate after his father's violent demise 2 years prior, modernizing the Mafia, pushing out the old guard, and expanding their operations into international shipping ports. As Bethany aggressively buffed a smudge off the glass doors of the main boardroom, the elevator dinged. It was 11:45 p.m. She quickly gathered her rags, intending to slip into the nearby utility closet. Her heavy footsteps padded softly against the carpet, but she wasn't fast enough. The glass door swung open, and a wave of intimidating men flooded the lobby. Leading the pack was Darcel Simmons himself. Bethany shrank back into the shadows of the hallway, her heart pounding against her ribs. Darcel was devastatingly handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features, jet-black hair swept back, and eyes as cold and gray as a winter storm. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that hugged his broad shoulders. Beside him walked his underboss, Lorenzo Bianchi, a heavily scarred man who looked perpetually on edge, and Silas Mercer, Simmons' head of security, a cruel-eyed man who terrified Bethany more than anyone else. "The Volkovs are arriving in 10 minutes. Darcel's voice was a low, smooth baritone that commanded absolute authority. "If this deal falls through, the ports in Marseille and Saint-Tile, Petersburg are closed to us, We need the weapons route secured by midnight. We have the best interpreters money can buy, boss, Silas grunted, adjusting the concealed holster beneath his jacket. 12 of them, experts in Russian, Chechen, French, and Mandarin. Volkov is bringing his global lieutenants. We're covered. Bethany held her breath in the closet, the smell of ammonia stinging her nose. She just needed them to go into the boardroom so she could slip out the service elevator. But as fate would have it, Darcel paused right outside her closet door. Volkov is a paranoid snake, Darcel murmured. He switches dialects when he lies. Tell the interpreters to watch his phrasing. If he uses the Chechen word for brother instead of the Russian, he's planning to kill us. Bethany's eyes widened in the dark. Chechen syntax combined with Russian vocabulary, she thought automatically. A classic misdirection tactic used in the Caucasus region to test a listener's loyalty. The men moved into the massive boardroom, the heavy oak doors sealing shut behind them. Bethany exhaled a shaky breath, her plump hands trembling. She pushed the utility closet door open, desperate to escape. But suddenly, the entire building shuddered. The emergency lockdown alarms blared to life, casting the hallway in a pulsating, sinister red glow. The heavy steel shutters over the windows slammed down automatically. Perimeter breach, Silas' voice roared from inside the boardroom. The Volkovs bypassed the lobby. They're coming up the private freight elevator. Bethany was trapped. The service elevator was locked out by the security protocol. With nowhere else to go, she dove behind the massive marble reception desk just outside the boardroom, her heavy body hitting the floor hard. She curled into a tight, trembling ball, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years that she would remain invisible just a little while longer. The heavy freight elevator doors roamed open down the hall, and the temperature in the corridor seemed to instantly drop. Bethany peeked through a small gap between the reception desk and the wall. Dr. Volkov stepped out. He was a mountain of a man, draped in a heavy mink coat despite the indoor heating, his face a roadmap of violence and knife scars. Behind him trailed a terrifying assortment of international criminals, French arms dealers, Chinese triad liaisons, and Chechen mercenaries. This was not a standard Mafia sit-down. This was a summit of the global underworld. The boardroom doors opened, and Darcel stood in the threshold, projecting calm dominance. Victor, you bypassed security. Security is for men who fear death, Darcel, Victor replied in heavily accented, booming English. I fear nothing. Shall we? The groups filed into the massive room. Because the doors were left slightly ajar by Silas's guards to monitor the hallway, Bethany could hear everything with terrifying clarity. The negotiation began, and it was an absolute linguistic nightmare. The deal involved a complex network of moving illicit cargo from a triad-controlled port in Macau, through a French Union-controlled dock in Marseille, up into Russian territory, and finally onto Simmons's ships in New York. The language shifted rapidly from English to Russian, to Mandarin to French, and into obscure regional dialects. Darcel's highly paid interpreters sat at the edge of the table, sweating profusely. The first to break was a young man in a tweed suit. Victor's Chechen lieutenant muttered something low and guttural. Translate, Darcel ordered. The interpreter stammered. He says the price of the cargo. It is too heavy for the ships. Bethany winced from her hiding spot behind the desk. Wrong, she thought. He used the idiom massa, which in that specific northern Chechen dialect means the blood price or toll. He's threatening attacks on your men's lives, not talking about cargo weight. Victor Volkov laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He looked at the interpreter with absolute disgust. Your boy is a fool, Simmons. He does not even know the words of my country. Get him out. Silas grabbed the terrified interpreter by the collar and hurled him out of the room. The man scrambled past Bethany's hiding spot, weeping. The pressure mounted. Over the next 45 minutes, the room devolved into chaos. Interpreter number 3, a woman specializing in French, failed to understand the Marseille dock boss's rapid-fire volan of French slang that reverses the syllables of words. She translated a promise of safe passage as a threat of a police raid. Guns were drawn. Darcel had to physically slam his hands on the table to stop the shootout, firing the woman on the spot. Interpreter number 7 fainted entirely when Victor casually placed a blood-stained hunting knife on the mahogany table to make a point about cutting shipping costs. Interpreter number 10, a Mandarin specialist, completely missed a subtle cultural threat from the triad representative, translating a polite insult about Darcel's ancestors as a compliment about his father. Victor, who understood basic Mandarin, caught the mistake and mocked Darcel relentlessly for hiring incompetence. By 1:30 a.m., 11 interpreters had been violently ejected, fleeing for their lives down the emergency stairwell. Only one remained, an older, distinguished man named Arthur, who was supposedly a master of Slavic languages. The tension in the room was a physical weight. Bethany was sweating so much her uniform stuck to her skin like a wet wrapper. Her knees throbbed from crouching. "We are wasting time, Simmons," Victor snarled, his patience gone. He switched entirely to rapid colloquial Russian, laced with obscure Gulag slang. Arthur, the final interpreter, paled. He says, if the route through Marseille is not cleared by tomorrow, he will. He will take the goods elsewhere. Bethany gasped softly, pressing her hands over her mouth. Arthur had just signed Darcel Simmons' death warrant. Victor hadn't said he would take the goods elsewhere. Victor had used a highly specific, antiquated Siberian prison phrase, "My rashistim sneg," literally, "we will clear the snow." But in the context of the Bratva, it meant we will wipe out the current management and leave no trace. Victor was signaling his men to execute Darcel right there at the table. Bethany heard the subtle, synchronized click of gun safeties being switched off by the Volkov men. Darcel, trusting his interpreter, remained seated, his posture relaxed, entirely unaware that he was about to be slaughtered. Panic seized Bethany. If Darcel died, a massive firefight would break out. The Volkovs would sweep the entire floor to ensure there were no witnesses. They would find her cowering behind the desk. She would be collateral damage, a nameless fat cleaning lady left bleeding on the marble floor. She had to do something. God help me, she thought. Bethany Foster gripped the edge of the marble reception desk with her chubby, calloused hands, pushed herself up on her aching knees, and stepped out into the light. The sudden appearance of a large woman in a bright blue sweat-stained cleaning uniform stumbling into the doorway of the boardroom caused a dead, stunned silence to fall over the room. 30 heavily armed, dangerous men turned their heads to stare at her. Bethany felt her face burn with humiliation and stark terror. She knew exactly how she looked. She looked ridiculous. Her hair was falling out of its messy bun. Her double chin was pressed against her chest in fear, and she was clutching a feather duster like a protective shield. Silas Mercer was the first to react. His face twisted in absolute fury. What the hell is this? How did this fat cow get past the perimeter? He drew his weapon, pointing it directly at Bethany's chest. "Get on the floor, you stupid bitch," Bethany whimpered, her knees buckling slightly, but she forced herself to stay standing. She looked past the barrel of Silas's gun, locking her terrified brown eyes onto the cold, gray eyes of Darcel Simmons. "He's lying," Bethany blurted out. Her voice was surprisingly clear, ringing through the tense room. Darcel raised a single, perfectly groomed eyebrow. He didn't look angry. He looked intensely curious. He raised a hand, a silent command for Silas to hold his fire. "Who is lying?" Darcel asked, his voice smooth and deadly quiet. Your interpreter," Bethany stammered, gesturing vaguely toward the pale, sweating Arthur. "He translated the Russian wrong, Mr. Per. Volkov didn't say he was taking the goods elsewhere." Viktor Volkov's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "And what does a scrubbing woman know of the words of men?" He rumbled, stepping forward, towering over her. Bethany swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked up at the massive Russian boss. She didn't speak in English. She didn't even speak in standard Russian. She spoke in the precise, guttural Siberian gulag slang Victor had just used. "He said he is going to clear the snow." Bethany spoke flawlessly, the harsh consonants rolling off her tongue with native precision. "He is telling his men to murder you, Mr. Simmons, and take the territory by force. The man by the window has his hand on a suppressed weapon in his coat." The room erupted. Before Volkov's lieutenant by the window could draw his weapon, Lorenzo Bianchi moved with blinding speed, pulling his own sidearm and shooting the Russian in the shoulder. The man collapsed, dropping a silenced pistol onto the carpet. Weapons were drawn on all sides, a Mexican standoff of epic proportions. Darcel stood up slowly, kicking his chair back. His eyes never left Bethany. The shock in the room was palpable. The head of the Volkov syndicate had just been outed by a chubby woman holding a duster. "Is this true, Victor?" Darcel asked, his voice dripping with lethal intent. Victor looked at Bethany as if she were a ghost. He spat on the floor. "Where did you find this creature, Simmons? She speaks the mud tongue of the old prisons." "I asked you a question, Victor," Darcel pressed, his men racking the slides of their assault rifles. Victor held up his hands in a mocking gesture of surrender. "A misunderstanding. Emotions run high. We are businessmen, Darcel. Let us sit." "No," Darcel said coldly. He turned his gaze fully onto Bethany. He looked at her not with the disgust she was used to, but with a sudden, intense appraisal. He took in her flushed, round face, her trembling hands, and the sheer bravery it took for her to step in front of 30 guns. "Arthur, get out. You're done in this city." The final interpreter didn't need to be told twice. He fled the room. Darcel walked slowly toward Bethany. She shrank back, terrified he was going to execute her for interrupting. Instead, he stopped a foot away from her. He was tall, his presence overwhelming. He smelled of expensive cologne and ozone. "What is your name?" he asked softly. Bethany. "Bethany Foster." "Well, Bethany Foster," Darcel said, a dangerous smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "It seems my payroll is full of highly educated idiots, and my building is being cleaned by a linguist. How many languages do you speak?" "E8, she whispered. "Fluently." "A few others, possibly." Silas scoffed loudly. "Boss, you can't be serious. Look at her. She's a glorified maid. She probably guessed." Darcel didn't look at Silas. He kept his eyes locked on Bethany. "The Triad representative," Darcel said. "What was his insult earlier?" "The one the Mandarin specialist missed." Bethany shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. He said your father was a dragon, but you are merely a loud gecko scrambling on the walls of his legacy." The Triad representative standing across the room visibly paled. A low, dark chuckle escaped Darcel's throat. It was a sound that sent shivers down the spines of his men. He turned back to the table, gesturing to the empty chair right beside his own, the seat of honor. "Drop the mop, Bethany," Darcel ordered softly, his eyes flashing with a mix of dark amusement and undeniable respect. "Come sit down. You just got a promotion." Bethany stood frozen. I have to finish buffing the floors on level 40. "The floors can rot," Darcel said, pulling the heavy leather chair out for her himself. "Tonight you speak for the Simmons family," Sid. Trembling, shedding her yellow rubber gloves, Bethany walked toward the table. The men parted for her, their eyes wide with disbelief. The fat, invisible cleaning lady sank into the plush leather chair beside the most dangerous man in the city. Darcel leaned over, his breath warm against her ear, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. "Translate everything, Bethany. Every lie, every hesitation. If you get me through this night alive." His gaze dropped momentarily to her lips before meeting her terrified brown eyes again. "I will make sure you never have to be invisible again." The negotiation resumed, but the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. With Bethany at his side, Darcel was no longer flying blind. The French arms dealer tried to slip a fast one past them, utilizing a rapid Marseille slang to suggest a hidden tariff on the shipping containers. Bethany caught it instantly, whispering the translation to Darcel. Darcel countered flawlessly, cutting the Frenchman's profit margin in half. The Chinese triad liaison attempted to negotiate a side deal with Volkov using an ancient Hakka dialect, assuming the Simmons camp was deaf to it. Bethany, whose second foster mother had been a Hakka immigrant, translated the betrayal in real time. Darcel immediately severed the triad's access to the Brooklyn docks, securing a massive advantage. For 3 hours, Bethany was a maestro conducting a symphony of criminal diplomacy. She translated not just the words, but the intent, the cultural nuances, and the hidden threats. She forgot about her aching feet and her tight uniform. For the first time in her life, her brilliant mind was being utilized, respected, and feared. Viktor Volkov, realizing he was entirely outmatched by the unassuming woman beside Darcel, finally conceded. The treaties were signed. The shipping routes were secured under Simmons's complete control. As the sun began to rise over the city skyline, casting a pale golden light through the boardroom windows, the rival syndicates filed out of the Callaway building, utterly defeated. Only Darcel, Lorenzo, Silas, and Bethany remained in the massive room. Bethany suddenly felt exhausted. The adrenaline crash hit her like a physical blow. She went to stand up, her knees popping loudly in the quiet room. I should go back to my cart." "Silas," Darcel said, not looking at his head of security. "Pack up Bethany's cart. Take it to the incinerator." Silas sneered. "Boss, come on. We used her. Let her go back to scrubbing toilets. She's a liability. She knows too much now. We should just put a bullet in her and be done with it." Before Bethany could even gasp, Darcel moved. In a blur of motion, he crossed the room, grabbed Silas by the throat, and slammed him against the mahogany wall paneling. Darcel's forearm pressed brutally against Silas's windpipe. "This woman," Darcel hissed, his voice a lethal vibrating threat, "just saved my life and secured my empire. If you ever disrespect her again, if you ever so much as look at her with anything less than absolute reverence, I will cut out your tongue and feed it to my dogs. Do you understand me?" Silas choked, his face turning purple, and nodded frantically. Darcel dropped him. Silas stumbled out of the room, coughing violently. Darcel turned back to Bethany. The violent, terrifying Mafia boss vanished, replaced by a man looking at her with a profound, burning intensity. He walked over to her, reaching out a hand. He didn't grab her arm. He gently took her hand, his thumb lightly brushing across her calloused knuckles. "You aren't a cleaning lady anymore, Bethany," Darcel said softly. "You are coming with me." Bethany looked up at him, her heart doing a painful, beautiful flutter in her chest. For the first time in 32 years, she wasn't just taking up space. She was seen, and as Darcel Simmons led her out of the boardroom, her hand held firmly in his, Bethany knew her life of invisibility was over forever. Morning sunlight shattered the gloom of the city, pouring through the bulletproof floor-to-ceiling windows of Darcel's sprawling penthouse atop the Baccarat Hotel. Bethany stood near the glass, staring down at the microscopic yellow taxis navigating the grid of Manhattan. Her cheap polyester uniform had been incinerated hours ago. In its place, she wore a plush, monogrammed silk robe that Darcel had ordered his private concierge to procure. It was meant for a large man, but it wrapped around her thick, soft curves perfectly, tying securely at her wide waist. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't scrubbing someone else's mess. She was standing in the epicenter of New York's organized crime network, drinking a cup of Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee that cost more than her weekly grocery budget. You look entirely too tense for a woman who just secured a monopoly on the eastern seaboard. Oh, Darcel's voice, a rich baritone, resonated from the kitchen island. He was dressed casually now, the bespoke suit discarded for a dark cashmere sweater and tailored trousers. Without the imposing jacket, he looked leaner, but no less dangerous. His eyes, however, held a warmth when he looked at her that left Bethany entirely flustered. "I feel like I'm trespassing, Mr. Simmons," Bethany admitted, her cheeks flushing hot pink. She instinctively pulled the silk robe tighter around her heavy chest. I'm a cleaner from the Bronx. This isn't my world." "Darcel," he corrected smoothly, walking toward her with a plate of fresh pastries. "And you are whatever you choose to be, Bethany. Last night you were a strategic genius. The remnants of the old Lucchese and Gambino families have been trying to decipher Victor Volkov's Siberian codes for a decade. You cracked it while holding a feather duster." He set the plate down and stood surprisingly close to her. Bethany held her breath. Men like Darcel Simmons, billionaire kingpins who graced the pages of Forbes under the guise of logistics CEOs, did not look at women like her. They dated waif-thin supermodels and glamorous socialites. They didn't look at fat women with double chins and stretch marks. Yet Darcel's gaze was fixed on her round, soft face with genuine fascination. "My men are terrified of you," Darcel added, a smirk playing on his lips. "Lorenzo has already asked if you can audit our offshore accounts in Geneva. He thinks you might speak Swiss banking codes, too." Bethany let out a nervous, breathy laugh. "I only know the languages, Darcel. I don't know the business. The business is just leverage and lies," a cold voice interrupted. Silas Mercer stepped out of the private elevator, his face bruised and his neck displaying the angry purple finger marks from Darcel's grip the night before. Silas' eyes burned with pure, unadulterated hatred as they locked onto Bethany. He looked her up and down, his lip curling in disgust at her size. "Boss," Silas said, forcing his gaze back to Darcel. "The tailors from Brioni are here, and a team of stylists from Bergdorf Goodman, like you asked, though I doubt they brought anything in a size 20. Darcel's expression instantly turned to stone. The warmth vanished, replaced by the ruthless predator who ruled the underworld. He closed the distance between himself and Silas in 2 long strides. "Silas," Darcel said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You are my head of security. You are not my conscience, and you are certainly not my tailor. If you ever make a comment about Bethany's body again, I will have Lorenzo drag you behind a Lincoln Navigator down the Long Island Expressway. Am I understood?" Silas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Understood, boss. Send them in," Darcel commanded, turning his back on his security chief. "And Silas, you are off the perimeter detail today. You will stand in the hallway and hold Bethany's shopping bags." Cart. The humiliation on Silas' face was absolute, but he nodded stiffly and retreated. Over the next 4 hours, the penthouse transformed into a private boutique. Darcel spared absolutely no expense. He sat on a velvet sofa, sipping espresso while a terrified but highly professional team of stylists draped Bethany in the finest fabrics money could buy. When a stylist subtly suggested a black, shapeless gown to slim her figure down, Darcel threw his espresso cup against the wall, shattering it. "Do not hide her," Darcel barked, silencing the entire room. He walked over to a rack of designer clothes, bypassing the dark, conservative garments, and pulled out an emerald green, custom-draped gown by Oscar de la Renta. It was designed to hug curves, not conceal them. He held it up against Bethany. "She is magnificent exactly as she is. Dress her to command the room, not to apologize for being in it." Tears pricked the corners of Bethany's eyes as she looked at herself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror later that afternoon, wearing the emerald silk that cascaded beautifully over her wide hips and thick thighs, her hair professionally styled into soft, elegant waves. She didn't recognize the woman looking back. She looked powerful. She looked regal. "Tonight," Darcel said, coming up behind her reflection, his hands gently resting on her broad shoulders. "We meet with the Corsican Brotherhood at the Pierre Hotel. They're notoriously tricky. They smile to your face and stab you in the back. I need my voice, Bethany. I need you." Tensions boiled over rapidly that evening in the opulent, gold-leafed private dining room of the Pierre. The Corsican Syndicate, led by a silver-haired, dangerously charismatic man named Pascal, was pushing for a larger cut of the weapons trade flowing through John F. Thrace Kennedy International Airport. Bethany sat to Darcel's right, looking every bit the Mafia queen in her emerald gown. Her presence alone threw the Corsicans off balance. They had expected Darcel's usual roster of nervous, sweaty translators. Instead, they faced a majestic, imposing woman who watched them with sharp, unblinking eyes. Silas stood by the heavy oak doors, his face a mask of bitter resentment, physically holding Bethany's new designer coat. The negotiations were brutal. Pascal spoke in rapid, heavily accented French, weaving in Corsican dialect to obfuscate his true demands. But Bethany was flawless. She leaned in, her soft voice cutting through the tension, translating not just the words, but the subtle threats beneath them. "He says the police at JFK are asking for higher bribes," Bethany murmured to Darcel, shielding her mouth. "But he used the Corsican word perta too, which implies a tax already collected. He isn't paying the police, Darcel. He's pocketing the difference." Darcel smiled coldly, calling Pascal out on the lie immediately. The Corsican boss paled, his confidence shattering. By the second hour, Darcel had backed Pascal into a corner, securing an incredibly lucrative deal for the Simmons family. It was a complete victory, but as Pascal and his men stood to leave, shaking hands and exchanging forced pleasantries, Bethany caught something that made her blood run cold. As Pascal walked past Silas at the door, the two men didn't speak. But Pascal coughed, a sharp, rhythmic sound, and Silas, looking straight ahead, tapped his index finger twice against the brass handle of the door. It was a microscopic exchange, easily missed by anyone not trained to observe the deepest subtleties of human communication. But Bethany had spent a lifetime being invisible, observing the world from the shadows. She knew a covert signal when she saw one. "Wait," Bethany said loudly. The entire room froze. Pascal turned around, raising an eyebrow. Darcel looked at Bethany, his hand instinctively dropping toward the Beretta, concealed under his suit jacket. "What is it, Bethany?" Darcel asked, his voice tight. Bethany stood up. Her heart was pounding, but the terrified cleaning lady was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her worth. She looked directly at Silas Mercer. "Mr. Mercer," Bethany said, her voice echoing in the silent dining room. "Do you speak Albanian?" Silas blinked, genuine confusion mixing with his anger. What? No. I'm from Brooklyn. Why the hell would I speak Albanian? That's fascinating, Bethany said, stepping out from behind the heavy mahogany table. Her emerald gown swept across the plush carpet. She walked slowly toward the door, because earlier today, while you were standing in the hallway, I heard you make a phone call. You thought I was busy with the tailors, but I have excellent hearing. Silas' face lost a fraction of its color. Boss, the fat bitch is crazy. I was talking to my bookie. Bethany ignored the insult. She stopped a few feet from Silas. You used a very specific phrase on that phone call. Steinikath. It's an old Albanian Mafia code. It means the wolf is in the trap. Darcel's eyes darkened to pitch black. Silas, explain. She's lying, Silas shouted, his hand twitching toward his holster. She's trying to set me up because I insulted her. Pascal, tell him. Bethany turned to Pascal. Pascal doesn't speak Albanian either, but he does employ an Albanian mercenary crew to handle his wet work. A crew that, according to the rhythmic cough Pascal just gave you, is currently waiting for us in the underground parking garage of this hotel. Pascal's hand flew to his jacket, but Lorenzo Bianchi was faster. In a second, Lorenzo had his weapon pressed firmly against the back of Pascal's skull. You tapped the door handle twice, Silas, Bethany continued, her voice remarkably steady. The universal underworld confirmation signal. You sold Darcel out. You were going to let Pascal's mercenaries ambush us at the cars, and in exchange, you'd take over the Simmons operations in Queens. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the heavy breathing of the trapped men. Silas looked desperately at Darcel, but he found no mercy in his boss's eyes. Darcel slowly walked across the room, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He stopped right in front of Silas. You betrayed me, Darcel said softly. But worse, you thought my Bethany was too stupid to catch you. Darcel, please, she's making it up. Darcel didn't draw a weapon. He simply nodded to Lorenzo. The chaos was instant and brutal. Lorenzo's men flooded the room, disarming Pascal and his crew in seconds. Silas drew his gun, but Darcel shattered his wrist with a vicious, martial strike. Silas screamed, dropping the weapon as he collapsed to his knees in front of Bethany. Check the garage, Darcel ordered his men. 10 minutes later, the radio on Lorenzo's belt crackled. Garage secure, boss. 6 Albanian shooters neutralized. They were waiting right by your armored SUV. Darcel looked down at the whimpering, broken security chief bleeding on the carpet. The hard karma had finally arrived for Silas Mercer. He had underestimated the invisible woman, and it had cost him everything. Take Silas to the meatpacking district, Darcel said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. Make sure it takes a very, very long time. As Silas was dragged out of the room, screaming for mercy, Darcel turned back to Bethany. The violence in his eyes melted away instantly. He reached out, gently cupping her soft, round cheek. His thumb brushed over a stray tear that had escaped her eye. You are extraordinary, Darcel whispered, leaning in so close she could feel the heat of his breath. You just saved my life. Again. Bethany looked up into his gray eyes, realizing that the most dangerous man in New York was entirely, unequivocally captivated by her. News of the massacre in the Pierre Hotel's parking garage spread through the New York underworld like a rampant virus. Within 48 hours, the Simmons Syndicate had absorbed the Corsican airport routes, and Darcel's power was absolute. But peace in the Mafia was an illusion, a fragile glass house waiting for a thrown stone. For 3 weeks, Bethany lived in the Baccarat penthouse. She was no longer a guest. She was the architect of Darcel's expanding empire. Her mind, once confined to audiobooks and scrub brushes, was now unleashed on international logistics, offshore banking, and cartel negotiations. Darcel adored her. He showered her with affection, tracing the soft curves of her wide hips and resting his head against her heavy, comforting chest at night. He looked at her not as a trophy, but as an equal, a queen who had earned her crown through sheer brilliance. But the old guard of the city was terrified. A 32-year-old Mafia boss was dangerous, but a boss guided by a genius savant who missed absolutely nothing was an existential threat. The summons arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by hand to the penthouse. It was a thick, black envelope sealed with dark red wax. Darcel broke the seal, his jaw tightening as he read the single heavy card inside. "The commission," he murmured, his voice laced with dread. "They are calling a sit-down at the Waldorf Astoria, the grand ballroom, tonight." Bethany, wearing a deep burgundy silk-wrap dress that accentuated her full figure, walked over and rested her hand on his broad shoulder. "The heads of the 5 families. Why now?" "Because of you, Bethany," a voice answered from the doorway. Lorenzo Bianchi, Darcy's heavily scarred underboss, stood leaning against the doorframe. He looked unusually calm for a man facing a commission summons. "They don't like that a civilian, a former cleaning woman, is sitting in on private syndicate meetings. They think Darcel has lost his mind. Word on the street is they are going to demand he hand you over to be silenced, or they will declare open war on the Simmons family." Bethany's breath hitched, her hands turning ice cold. "They want to kill me." "I won't let that happen," Darcel swore, stepping in front of her protectively. He looked at Lorenzo. "Gather our best men. We walk into the Waldorf heavy. If Albert Genovese thinks he can dictate who stands by my side, I'll burn the 5 families to the ground." "I already have the men on standby, boss." Lorenzo nodded smoothly. "We leave in an hour." As Lorenzo exited, Bethany felt a strange, cold prickle at the back of her neck. Something was wrong. Her mind, trained to pick up on micro-expressions and tonal shifts, replayed Lorenzo's words. He looked unusually calm. He didn't have the frantic energy of a man preparing for a war. He had the quiet confidence of a man who already knew the outcome. "Darcel," Bethany whispered, walking over to the massive mahogany desk where Lorenzo had left a stack of financial manifests earlier that morning. "While you were at the docks yesterday, I was bored. So I started looking through Lorenzo's internal routing numbers for the new airport payouts." "Bethany, we don't have time for bookkeeping right now," Darcel said, checking the magazine of his sidearm. "You need to listen to me," she insisted, her voice taking on the sharp, commanding tone that made hardened criminals flinch. She pulled out a leather-bound ledger. "I have a photographic memory for numbers. When I used to clean the Callaway building, I saw the discarded bank statements of the executive board. Lorenzo's offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. They aren't matching the Simmons family income. He's moving millions of dollars through a dummy corporation called Vanguard Holdings." Darcel froze. "Vanguard? That's an old shell company used by Albert Genovese," Bethany finished, her brown eyes wide with realization. "The head of the commission." The puzzle pieces violently slammed into place in Bethany's mind. Silas Mercer hadn't been acting alone. Silas was too stupid to orchestrate a coup. "Lorenzo," Darcel whispered, his face draining of color. "Lorenzo shot the Volkov lieutenant during your first night to start the shootout. He wanted me to die in the crossfire. When that failed, he used Silas to set up the Corsican ambush. And now, me. He has orchestrated this sit-down at the Waldorf," Bethany said, her voice trembling slightly, but her spine completely straight. "Lorenzo isn't gathering your men to protect you, Darcel. He's gathering men loyal to him to trap you. When we walk into that ballroom tonight, it's not a negotiation. It's an execution. Darcel stared at the woman he loved. She had just pulled him back from the edge of the abyss for the third time. A cold, terrifying fury settled over his features. The young Mafia kingpin smiled a dark, lethal expression. "Get your coat, my love," Darcel said, reaching into his safe and pulling out a second weapon, sliding it into an ankle holster. "We are going to a party." Crystal chandeliers, draped in decades of history and millions of dollars of cut glass, cast a cold, unforgiving light over the historic grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria. The cavernous room, usually echoing with the laughter of high society galas and presidential receptions, was entirely stripped of its warmth. It was completely empty, save for a massive antique wooden table positioned perfectly in the center. The silence in the room was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating weight, pregnant with the promise of violence. Sitting at the head of the long table was Albert, the ghost Genovese. Even seated, the elderly boss possessed an aura of quiet, paralyzing menace that seemed to suck the oxygen from the air. Around him sat the other aging patriarchs of the New York underworld, their faces hardened masks of cruelty and lifetimes spent dealing in shadows. They were apex predators, completely accustomed to total obedience. When the heavy oak doors groaned open, Darcel Simmons walked in. He did not possess the frantic, sweaty energy of a man walking into a designated slaughter. He radiated an absolute terrifying power, his stride long and deliberate, and holding his arm, walking with a steady, majestic grace that commanded the attention of every killer in the room, was Bethany Foster. Her deep burgundy silk dress swept elegantly across the polished marble floor. Only weeks ago, heavy footsteps in cheap rubber shoes were ignored by everyone. Now every eye was locked onto her wide, commanding silhouette. She kept her chin held high, her large, soft presence entirely unfazed by the predatory stares of the most dangerous men in America. Underneath her calm exterior, Bethany's mind was racing, a savant-like perception analyzing everything: the nervous twitch in the jaw of the Lucchese boss, the way the guards positioned their hands near their lapels, the stale smell of expensive cigars and cold sweat. Lorenzo Bianchi trailed closely behind Darcel and Bethany, a smug, hidden smile playing on his severely scarred lips. As they approached the long table, the heavy ballroom doors behind them slammed shut. The metallic heavy click of the deadbolts engaging echoed like a gunshot. The trap was officially sprung. "Darcel," Albert Genovese wheezed. His voice was dry and rattling, sounding like crushed autumn leaves scraped across pavement. "You insult us. You bring the help to a meeting of the commission." Darcel's expression remained carved from stone. He did not immediately answer. Instead, he pulled a heavy, velvet-lined chair out for Bethany, waiting for her to sit before taking the seat beside her. He adjusted his impeccably tailored jacket, leaning back with supreme confidence. "She isn't the help, Albert," Darcel said smoothly, his rich baritone slicing through the tension. "She is my consigliere and the future matriarch of the Simmons family. You will address her with respect, or we will not speak at all." A collective murmur of outrage and disbelief rippled through the old bosses. Men gripped the edges of the table. Some muttered curses in Sicilian. Albert raised a frail, liver-spotted hand, instantly silencing the room. He did not look at Bethany. He looked directly at Lorenzo, who was standing like a shadow behind Darcel's right shoulder. "It is a tragedy, Darcel," Albert murmured, genuine pity lacing his raspy tone. "Your father was a great, reasonable man, but you have let a fat, low-born maid poison your mind. You are no longer fit to lead this syndicate. Lorenzo, do what must be done." The shift in the room was microscopic but absolute. Lorenzo drew his suppressed pistol with practiced lethal speed, aiming the black barrel directly at the back of Darcel's head. "Don't move, boss," Lorenzo sneered. the mask of a loyal underboss finally dropping to reveal the ambitious viper beneath. The quiet click of the safety being switched off sounded deafening. It's nothing personal, but the Simmons empire is too big for a man who thinks with his heart. Darcel did not flinch. He did not reach for his ankle holster. He did not even turn his head to look at the man about to pull the trigger. He simply looked across the table at Bethany and gave her a slight, nearly imperceptible nod. Absolute trust. Bethany remained perfectly seated. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands, placed flat upon the antique wood, did not tremble. She looked past Lorenzo's weapon. She ignored the drawn guns of the Commission's perimeter guards. She locked her sharp, brilliant brown eyes directly onto the hollow, sunken eyes of Albert Genovese. She did not speak in English. She spoke in a flawless, ancient Neapolitan dialect, the specific, gritty language of Albert's impoverished childhood, a tongue rarely heard outside the oldest, forgotten villages of southern Italy. Albert of the Genovese line. Bethany's voice echoed in the grand room. It was not the voice of a terrified cleaner. It was rich, commanding, and laced with absolute certainty. You are a fool to trust the scarred dog behind us. He does not wish to serve you. He wishes to replace you. Albert's eyes widened in profound, unadulterated shock. Hearing his native, dying dialect spoken with such perfect inflection by this woman rattled him down to his very marrow. The other bosses looked around in confusion, unable to understand the rapid ancient words. "What lies do you speak, witch?" Albert rasped back in Neapolitan, his frail hands trembling slightly against the tabletop. "I speak the numbers," Bethany continued flawlessly, leaning forward, her presence dominating the massive space. In her mind, the photographic memory of the ledgers she had seen illuminated like a glowing screen. Account 884 to 291B in the Cayman Islands, under the shell company Vanguard Holdings. "It is your private retirement fund, is it not?" Albert's face went chalk white. The color drained from his lips. No one alive, not even his own sons, knew that specific account number. "For the past 6 months, Bethany said, her voice rising slightly, ringing with righteous, devastating authority, "Lorenzo Bianchi has been siphoning exactly 18% of your dock tariffs into a secondary, hidden account in Geneva, routing number 44902Z. He is bleeding you dry, Albert. He used you to sanction Darcel's death so he could take over the Simmons family without a war. And then he was going to use your own stolen money to buy the Commission out from under you. You are funding your own assassination. She's lying." Lorenzo shouted in English, panic finally shattering his arrogant composure. His gun hand wavered wildly. He couldn't understand a single word of the Neapolitan dialect, but he could read the sheer murderous realization dawning on Albert Genovese's face. "Albert, tell your men to open fire. Kill them both now." Albert Genovese slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. The frail old man was gone, replaced by the terrifying phantom who had ruled the underworld for 40 years. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at Lorenzo. "Occidilo," Albert whispered, the command slicing through the air like a blade. "Kill him." The hard karma was instantaneous, brutal, and entirely merciless. Before Lorenzo could redirect his weapon to fire at Darcel, the 3 Commission guards standing around the perimeter of the room drew their heavy sidearms and fired simultaneously. The suppressed shots were like vicious cracks of a whip. Lorenzo Bianchi's body jerked violently as the heavy-caliber bullets struck him in the chest and throat. His pistol clattered uselessly to the floor. He collapsed onto the cold marble tiles in a heap of tailored wool and spilled ambition, choking on his own blood, his grand plans bleeding out beneath the glittering chandeliers of the Waldorf Astoria. A suffocating, heavy silence descended upon the ballroom once again, broken only by the sharp scent of cordite hanging in the air. Darcel calmly stood up, casually adjusting his silver cufflinks as if he had just finished a mild business dinner. He looked down at the lifeless body of his treacherous underboss, feeling absolutely nothing but cold clinical satisfaction. Then he raised his chin, looking at the terrified, aging men of the commission who were now staring at Bethany as if she were a deity. "Bethany Foster is not a maid," Darcel said, his voice echoing with chilling finality. "She is the sharpest mind in the city. She just saved your fortune, Albert. And she just saved my life. The Simmons family is leaving this room. We keep the ports. We keep the airports. And if any of you ever disrespect my future wife again, she won't just find your hidden bank accounts. I will ensure she empties them before I burn your houses down." Nobody dared to breathe, let alone speak a word of objection. Albert Genovese slowly sank back into his chair, utterly defeated and entirely outmaneuvered by the brilliant, magnificent woman sitting across from him. Darcel offered his hand to Bethany. She took it, his warm, strong grip anchoring her. As they turned their backs on the commission and walked out of the grand ballroom, leaving the old guard shaking in their bespoke suits, Bethany felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace wash over her. She had spent her entire life shrinking herself, apologizing for her size, trying to be invisible, believing her background made her inherently unworthy of being noticed. But as the heavy doors of the Waldorf Astoria were unlocked and opened for them, and they stepped out into the crisp, biting New York night air, Darcel pulled her into a deep, passionate kiss beneath the glowing streetlights. In that moment, she knew the undeniable truth. She was powerful. She was brilliant, and in the dark, dangerous and unforgiving world of Darcel Simmons, the chubby cleaning lady was the most formidable force of all. Bethany Foster's journey from a dismissed, invisible cleaner to the most feared and respected strategist in the New York underworld stands as a testament to the fatal flaw of underestimation. In a society obsessed with superficial appearances, the men of the Mafia looked at her heavy frame and saw weakness. They saw someone beneath their notice. They failed to realize that true power does not reside in a bespoke suit or a sculpted physique, but in an unbreakable mind. By utilizing her extraordinary intellect and linguistic mastery, Bethany shattered the glass ceiling of a violent patriarchy. Her relentless rise triggered the hard, unyielding karma that annihilated the arrogant men who sought to exploit or discard her. Ultimately, her alliance with Darcel Simmons proved that true love and loyalty are forged in mutual respect, turning a terrifying battle for survival into a magnificent empire ruled by the very woman they once ignored.